Hook, 20 years before one of South Korea's most powerful criminal empires stood on the edge of collapse, its feared leader made a decision that no one around him could understand. It happened on a winter night, when icy rain swept across the back streets of Busan. Luxury sedans waited with their engines running, while armed men searched every alley for signs of an ambush. Their boss, a man prosecutors had chased for decades and rivals whispered about only behind closed doors, suddenly stopped walking, not because he sensed danger, because he heard a child coughing. Hidden beneath a collapsed market stall was a girl no older than 6. Her shoes didn't match. Her coat belonged to someone twice her size. She held a broken music box, as though it were the last proof that another life had once existed. His bodyguards expected him to keep moving. Instead, the man everyone called a monster knelt in the freezing rain. Without asking her name, without checking who she belonged to, he carried her into his car. No one questioned him. Not that night. Not for the next 20 years. The little girl disappeared from government records almost overnight. She grew up inside a world built on absolute loyalty, expensive silence, and invisible power. To outsiders, she was simply the adopted daughter of an influential businessman. Only a handful of people knew whose roof truly sheltered her, or what kind of empire paid for her education. Then, on an ordinary morning, that empire began to crumble. Police raids, frozen assets, betrayals from within, witnesses lining up to testify. The boss who had once controlled entire cities now sat alone in a courtroom, facing charges that could erase everything he had built. Even his closest allies believed it was over, until the courtroom doors opened. A young woman walked inside, carrying nothing but a leather briefcase and 20 years of unanswered questions. The little girl everyone thought had been rescued was about to become the only person capable of saving the man who had saved her first. Act 1, a chance encounter. For most of South Korea, Chairman Kang Min-suk was a mystery wrapped in contradiction. Officially, he was the founder of a sprawling logistics and shipping conglomerate that stretched from the ports of Busan to warehouses across East Asia. His companies employed thousands, sponsored hospitals, and donated generously after natural disasters. His face appeared in business magazines far more often than in police files. Unofficially, investigators had spent decades trying to prove that beneath the polished image was a quiet architect of one of the country's most disciplined criminal organizations. They suspected his empire controlled smuggling routes, underground financial networks, and a web of loyal operators who left almost no evidence behind. Rumors surrounded him like fog. Facts were much harder to find. Yet those who worked closest to Kong rarely described him as violent. They described him as patient, calculating, a man who believed the greatest display of power was making others choose loyalty without ever raising his voice. Then there was the girl. Her name was Han Seo-yeon. No birth certificate could explain where she came from. No surviving relatives ever came looking for her. The only thing she remembered from the night she was found was the sound of rain hitting rusted metal and a melody from the cracked music box. She refused to let go. Kong never asked anyone to erase her past. He simply refused to let it define her future. She was given a warm room, regular meals, tutors, and eventually admission into one of Seoul's most prestigious private schools. While the adults around Kong addressed him with rigid formality, Seo-yeon called him something almost no one else dared to use. Father. The word always made the room fall silent. His lieutenants never knew what to make of their boss around the child. The feared strategist who negotiated with hardened criminals somehow found time to help a little girl solve mathematics homework. He attended school recitals without security standing beside him. Every birthday, despite never remembering his own, he baked an imperfect chocolate cake himself, a tradition so clumsy that the kitchen staff secretly prepared another one in case it collapsed. He never spoke much about love. He demonstrated it in habits. As Seo-yeon grew older, she began noticing the contradictions that defined the household. Expensive suits hid old scars. Family dinners were interrupted by encrypted phone calls. Men who seemed fearless around everyone else lowered their eyes whenever Kong entered the room. Questions lingered in every hallway, but answers were always replaced with gentle smiles. Kong encouraged her to study hard, learn languages, and think independently. The The strongest person, he once told her, is the one who understands the law better than those who try to bend it. She carried those words with her. Years later, while many expected the adopted daughter of a powerful businessman to inherit boardrooms and corporate influence, Seo-yeon surprised everyone. She enrolled in law school. Some assumed it was another way to protect the family's interests. Others believed she wanted to distance herself from them entirely. Only Kong seemed unsurprised. On the day she left for university, he handed her the old music box he had preserved since the night they met. "You came into my life with this," he said quietly. "One day it will remind you why truth matters." At the time, Seo-yeon believed he was talking about her past. She had no idea he was preparing her for his own. Act 2, the first cracks. Law school gave Han Seo-yeon something she had never truly possessed growing up inside Kong Min-suk's carefully guarded world. Distance. For the first time, she lived beyond the walls of the estate where every visitor was screened, every conversation measured, and every question answered with another question. The farther she moved from home, the more ordinary life became. She made friends who knew nothing about her family. She studied late into the night, argued legal theory with professors, and earned a reputation for dismantling complex cases with calm, relentless logic. She graduated at the top of her class. Soon after, she joined one of Seoul's most respected law firms, not because of her surname, but because of her extraordinary ability to uncover inconsistencies others overlooked. Ironically, she chose corporate compliance and financial law. She believed transparency protected honest businesses. She had no idea how much those principles would soon collide with the family that had raised her. Whenever she visited home, Kong never asked about her clients or confidential work. Instead, he asked whether she was eating well, whether she was sleeping enough, and whether she was still finding joy outside the courtroom. It was almost as though he wanted her life to remain untouched by his own. But the illusion could not last forever. The first sign appeared in the form of a single newspaper headline. A regional shipping executive had vanished after agreeing to cooperate with federal prosecutors. Within days, investigators launched coordinated raids on several logistics companies suspected of operating an international money laundering network. Most viewers treated it as another corruption scandal. Seo-yeon noticed something else. One of the companies mentioned in the investigation belonged to Kong Group. When she called home, Kong answered with unusual warmth, almost as if he had expected the call. "It's business," he said calmly. "Businesses survive investigations all the time." His voice sounded steady, too steady. A week later, another headline appeared. Then another. Former executives began resigning without explanation. Corporate accounts were frozen. Anonymous witnesses surfaced, each claiming to possess information that could finally expose the secret structure behind Kang's empire. Television crews camped outside company headquarters around the clock. Public opinion shifted almost overnight. The philanthropist who had funded hospitals was suddenly portrayed as the hidden kingpin behind decades of organized crime. Seo-yeon wanted to dismiss the accusations as sensationalism, but the evidence kept growing. Then came the moment she couldn't ignore. One evening, while reviewing documents for an unrelated corporate dispute, she noticed a familiar signature buried inside a decades-old shipping contract. The handwriting belonged to one of Kang's oldest advisors, a man she had known since childhood. Yet the contract had been altered years after it was supposedly signed. Someone had forged official records. As she dug deeper, more irregularities emerged. Entire companies appeared to exist only on paper. Ownership changed overnight through shell corporations. Millions of dollars flowed through accounts that seemed designed to disappear before regulators could trace them. The patterns were too sophisticated to be accidental. Someone had built an invisible financial maze. But one detail refused to fit. Every suspicious transaction began years after Kong had publicly stepped away from day-to-day operations. If he truly controlled everything, why did the timeline suggest someone else had taken over? That question haunted her. Unable to silence her doubts, Seo-yeon drove to the family estate late one evening. The house felt strangely quiet. Many of Kang's longtime security staff were gone. Hallways that once echoed with activity now stood almost empty. She found him alone in his study, looking through an old wooden box. Inside were faded photographs, a tiny pair of mismatched shoes, and the broken music box from a night he found her. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Finally, Kong closed the lid and looked at her with an expression she had never seen before. Not fear, regret. "If the day ever comes," he said softly, "when the world tells you I'm a monster." He paused, as though weighing every word. "Don't defend me because I'm your father." Seo-yun's heart sank. Defend only the truth. Before she could ask what he meant, the sound of tires screeching outside shattered the silence. Blue emergency lights flooded the windows. Search warrants. Armed investigators. And within minutes, the man who had rescued a homeless little girl 20 years earlier was walking out of his own home in handcuffs, without resisting once. Act 3. Choosing the truth. The images spread across the country before sunrise. News helicopters circled overhead as Kong Min-suk was escorted to a corridor of investigators. Camera shutters clicked relentlessly. Reporters shouted accusations that blended into one deafening chorus. "Is it true you led the syndicate? How many officials were bribed? Do you admit to ordering illegal operations?" Kong never answered. He walked with the same measured calm that had unsettled rivals for decades, his expression unreadable as the courthouse doors closed behind him. By evening, the verdict had already been reached in the court of public opinion. To millions, he was guilty. Seo-yun watched every broadcast from her apartment, replaying the footage until dawn. She wasn't searching for evidence. She was searching for the man she knew, the father who stayed awake when she had nightmares, the man who patiently taught her chess, insisting every move carried consequences, the one who had never lied to her, not directly, at least. Yet one question refused to leave her mind. What if she had only known the version of him he wanted her to see? The following morning, her law firm called an emergency meeting. The managing partner spoke carefully. "The government expects more arrests. Anyone with personal ties to the Kong organization must disclose them immediately." Every eye in the conference room turned toward Seo-yun. She had spent years hiding behind professionalism, allowing her work to define her instead of her family name. Now there was nowhere left to hide. She admitted the truth. Silence followed. By the end of the meeting, she was placed on indefinite leave. No accusations, no anger, just distance. As she packed her office, colleagues who had once admired her quietly avoided eye contact. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked relieved. In a single afternoon, the life she had built through merit began slipping away. Not because of anything she had done, but because of the man who had raised her. For the first time since childhood, she felt completely alone. Days later, she was granted permission to visit Kong in detention. The interview room was stark and cold, separated by reinforced glass. He looked older, not broken, but tired in a way she had never witnessed before. "You shouldn't be here," he said gently. "I need answers. You need a future. My future began the night you picked me up off that street." He lowered his eyes. Then, almost reluctantly, he spoke. "I have done things I'm not proud of." The admission hit her harder than any headline. "I made alliances with dangerous men because I believed it protected the people under my care. I convinced myself that control prevented chaos. Sometimes it did." He looked back at her. "But somewhere along the way, others learned to use my name for things I never approved." Seo-yun listened without interrupting. It wasn't a confession, nor was it a denial. It was something far more complicated. Before the guard ended the visit, Kong reached into his prison-issue belongings and asked permission to hand her a folded envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No explanation. Just 5 names, 5 dates, and one handwritten sentence. Trust documents. Never trust memories. That night, Seo-yun spread the papers across her dining table. The names belonged to former executives, accountants, and legal advisors. People who had either disappeared, died under mysterious circumstances, or recently agreed to testify against Kong. At first glance, there was no connection. Then she noticed it. Every one of them had signed documents after the dates listed beside their names. Impossible. 2 signatures appeared months after one executive had reportedly died. Another witness had approved financial transfers while supposedly overseas. according to immigration records. The timeline didn't make sense. Someone had manufactured evidence with incredible precision, not to hide the truth, but to rewrite it. As she dug deeper into archived filings, encrypted corporate records, and forgotten court documents, an unsettling pattern emerged. The fraudulent transactions all traced back to a single restructuring that had occurred nearly 15 years earlier, shortly after Kong stepped back from daily operations. Someone had quietly taken control, while allowing the world to believe Kong still held every string. The empire had not simply been infiltrated. It had been stolen from within. For years, the real architect had hidden behind the reputation of a man everyone already feared. Soo-jin leaned back in her chair as dawn broke through the window. She finally understood why Kong had never asked her to prove his innocence. He had asked her to defend the truth, and the truth was far more dangerous than anyone in that courtroom was prepared to hear. Act 4, Into the Unknown. The moment Han Seo-yeon decided to follow the evidence instead of the headlines, there was no turning back. The case was no longer about clearing Kong Min-suk's name. It was about exposing a deception that had been quietly engineered for nearly 2 decades. She resigned from her law firm before anyone could pressure her to step aside permanently. Overnight, she lost access to the resources, reputation, and protection that came with one of the country's most prestigious legal institutions. All she had left were the files on her dining table, an old music box sitting beside them, and a promise she had silently made to the man who had once rescued her from the streets. The first ally appeared from an unexpected place. Park Jae-hyun, a retired forensic accountant who had testified in several of the country's largest financial crime cases, contacted her after reading about her suspension. Years earlier, he had investigated one of Kong Group's subsidiaries, but was abruptly removed from the case before he could finish. "I always believed the numbers were lying," he told her. "I just couldn't prove who taught them to." Together, they began reconstructing 15 years of financial records, tracing thousands of transactions that crossed borders through shell companies, offshore accounts, and seemingly legitimate logistics firms. Each discovery led to another question. Money disappeared only to reappear under different corporate names. Witness statements matched forged accounting entries almost word for word. Even government evidence contained timestamps that contradicted official banking records. Someone hadn't simply committed financial fraud. They had choreographed an entire legal narrative. But every step closer to the truth came with a cost. Seo-yeon noticed unfamiliar cars parked outside her apartment. Anonymous calls arrived in the middle of the night, followed only by silence. Her email accounts were breached. One evening, she returned home to find her files scattered across the floor. Nothing had been stolen. Nothing had been damaged. It was a message. Someone wanted her to know they could reach her whenever they wished. For the first time since the investigation began, fear settled into her bones. Not fear for herself. Fear that she was getting too close. Park urged her to stop. "The evidence we already have is enough to raise doubts," he said. "You don't need to risk your life chasing the rest." But Seo-yeon remembered something Kong had taught her years ago while they played chess. The most dangerous move is stopping one square before the truth. She couldn't stop now. Days later, a breakthrough arrived from the least likely source. An elderly woman requested a private meeting. She introduced herself as Yoon Hae-jin, a former executive assistant who had worked beside Kong for over 30 years before quietly retiring. She carried a weathered ledger wrapped in cloth. "I've kept this hidden for a long time," she whispered. Inside were handwritten meeting logs that had never been digitized. Unlike corporate records, these pages couldn't be altered remotely. Every meeting, every visitor, every authorization. And buried among them was a name that appeared again and again during the years the fraudulent network expanded. A man almost invisible to investigators. Kang's former chief legal advisor. The trusted strategist who had publicly disappeared after announcing his retirement 15 years earlier. According to every official record, he had left the organization. According to the ledger, he had never truly left. He had simply moved into shadows, quietly directing the empire while allowing Kong Min-suk to remain the face the world already feared. Seo-yeon stared at the pages in stunned silence. The missing piece had finally surfaced. The enemy had never been outside the empire. He had been standing beside her father all along, patiently waiting for the day he could sacrifice him to protect himself. With the trial only days away, Seo-yun gathered every document, every ledger, every forensic report, and every contradiction they had uncovered. She knew the courtroom would become more than a place of judgment. It would become the battlefield where truth and deception would face each other for the final time. And for the first time in 20 years, the homeless little girl Kong had carried out of the rain was about to carry him through the darkest day of his life. Act 5, Saving the Empire. The courtroom was already overflowing when Han Soo-yun walked through its doors. Reporters leaned forward. Prosecutors exchanged confident glances. Former associates who had agreed to testify avoided looking in Kong Min-suk's direction. To them, the outcome seemed inevitable. Kong himself sat quietly beside his defense team, his hands folded, his expression unchanged. When he saw Seo-yun take her place behind the counsel's table, he didn't smile. He simply nodded. It was the same quiet gesture he had given her years earlier before every school exam, a silent reminder that preparation mattered more than confidence. The prosecution spent hours presenting what appeared to be an airtight case. Financial records, witness testimony, wire transfers, and corporate documents painted Kong as the unquestioned architect of a vast criminal enterprise. Then it was Seo-yun's turn. She didn't begin with emotion. She began with time. Using certified banking records, immigration logs, and the handwritten ledger, she reconstructed a timeline that exposed contradiction after contradiction. Documents had been signed by people who were no longer alive. Meetings had supposedly taken place while key witnesses were overseas. Financial authorizations bore digital timestamps that couldn't have existed when the records were allegedly created. One by one, the certainty in the courtroom began to unravel. The defining moment came when she introduced evidence linking the forged records to Kang's former chief legal advisor. The man who had hidden in the background for 15 years had quietly redirected billions through shell companies while using Kang's fearsome reputation as the perfect shield. The empire hadn't been built on one man's deception. It had been hijacked by another's ambition. By the time Seo-yun finished, the courtroom was silent, not because every question had been answered, but because the truth could no longer be ignored. The judges ordered an immediate review of the prosecution's evidence and authorized a criminal investigation into the hidden network that had manipulated the case. For the first time since his arrest, Kong Min-suk looked at his daughter with unmistakable pride. She hadn't saved him by denying his past. She had saved him by refusing to let lies become history. Act 6, A Daughter by Choice. The investigation that followed lasted for months. Hidden accounts were uncovered. Forged corporate records were traced back to a network of trusted insiders who had quietly exploited Kong Min-suk's reputation while enriching themselves in the shadows. Several senior figures were arrested, and prosecutors were forced to admit that critical evidence in the original case had been manipulated. Kong was not declared a perfect man. The court acknowledged that, in his earlier years, he had built relationships with dangerous people and made decisions that blurred the line between survival and legality. But it also recognized that he had not orchestrated the vast conspiracy for which he had been blamed. The charges that threatened to destroy everything he had built were dismantled piece by piece, and his legitimate businesses were allowed to continue under strict independent oversight. When Kong finally walked out of the courthouse, there were no victory speeches and no celebration. Only one person waiting at the bottom of the steps. So-yun. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Kong reached into his coat and handed her the old music box, the same one she had clung to as a frightened child beneath a broken market stall 20 years earlier. "I kept it because I thought I had rescued you," he said quietly. He looked at her with eyes softened by age and humility. "I was wrong." A faint smile crossed Seo-yun's face. "You gave me a home," she replied. "But today, I had the chance to give you something back." As they stood together, the music box played its fragile melody once more, not as a reminder of the night a homeless little girl was found, but a family that had been built through compassion rather than blood. History would always debate who Kong Min-suk had been. Some would remember the feared boss. Others would remember the businessman. But one woman would remember the man who stopped in the rain, lifted a forgotten child into his arms, and changed 2 lives forever. Because in the end, The greatest empire he ever built wasn't measured in money or power. It was the unwavering love of the daughter who chose, when the whole world turned away, to stand for the truth,